Marion Bowman's execution, a true crime story of injustice and controversy. On a somber Friday evening, South Carolina ended the life of Marion Bowman Jr., a 44-year-old man who maintained his innocence to his dying breath. Bowman was convicted for the 2001 killing of Kandee Martin and spent over 2 decades on death row. His final moments, marked by his poignant last words, "We are not what the state labels us. We are kind, caring, loving people," resonate as a stark counterpoint to the justice system that decided his fate. This execution was not just another addition to the records of capital punishment. It was a tragic chapter in a long narrative of systemic failure, unresolved questions, and human endurance. South Carolina, having reignited capital punishment after a 13-year hiatus, used the controversial drug pentobarbital in Bowman's execution. This raises pressing ethical concerns about the methods chosen for such irreversible decisions. Bowman's story, however, is about much more than his death. It epitomizes the broader flaws of a justice system fraught with racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, and an indifference to human reform. Marion Bowman Jr. wasn't born into the labels society thrust upon him. Before his incarceration, he was more than an inmate on death row. He was a son and a friend. Raised in South Carolina, Bowman's world changed irrevocably when he was accused of murdering Kandee Martin, a crime he denied committing. His conviction was based on fragile evidence, including testimony from co-defendants who secured plea deals for themselves. Yet Bowman refused to accept a plea bargain that would have possibly saved him from execution, insisting instead on his innocence. This decision, many argue, highlights not only Bowman's integrity, but also the pressures placed on those accused of heinous crimes to admit guilt, regardless of their innocence. It is impossible to dive into Bowman's story without examining why a man facing death would willingly redeal out of sheer moral conviction. To connect the dots in this case, we must dissect the trial that sealed Marion Bowman's fate. The prosecution presented a narrative that painted Bowman as a cold-blooded killer, while the defense was seemingly inadequate from the outset. Allegations later surfaced that evidence crucial to Bowman's defense may have been withheld. Co-defendants, one of whom provided key testimony against Bowman, received reduced sentences in exchange, sparking debates about the reliability of their accounts. Racial bias also lingers at the heart of the judicial process. Bowman's court-appointed attorney admitted that Bowman was pressured to consider pleading guilty largely because of his race, as the prospect of a black man receiving a fair trial in the deeply divided southern state seemed unlikely. This bias wasn't unique to Bowman's case. It reflects a systemic problem in the United States, where studies consistently reveal racial disparities in capital punishment cases are rampant. For over 2 decades, Bowman lived in the grimmest of circumstances, death row. Prison is already a dehumanizing environment for many, but death row comes with its own form of psychological torment. Isolated for 23 hours a day, Bowman spent years in solitary confinement, a practice that has long been decried as cruel and unusual punishment, but remains prevalent across American prisons. In those long hours of darkness, Bowman's transformation began. He read voraciously, wrote letters, and made efforts to connect with those outside the concrete walls enclosing him. While society continued to paint him as a monster, Bowman discovered the power of his voice, speaking out against the very system that confined him. His personal evolution reflected not just resilience, but also a deeper testament to the humanity society often overlooks when discussing those deemed the worst of the worst. Marion Bowman's later years were not silent. Even though prison tried to keep him voiceless, he became an outspoken critic of the death penalty and the punishing conditions in which those awaiting execution are forced to live. To those who knew him, Bowman wasn't defined by the crime he was accused of, but by the person he had become during his decades of incarceration. He spoke against the inhumane treatment of inmates and tried to shed light on the moral questions surrounding state-sanctioned killings. His words in his final days, messages of kindness, forgiveness, and love, challenged the narrative that condemned men are inherently incapable of redemption. South Carolina's decision to execute Bowman via the lethal injection drug pentobarbital reignited the debate surrounding methods of execution. Reports of painful deaths using the drug in other states had already attracted criticism, yet it continues to be used due to limited alternatives. Questions remain about the secrecy surrounding drug suppliers and whether these methods align with federal standards on humane treatment. Activists argue that Bowman's case illustrates the state's rush to make an example of its power rather than carefully reviewing the circumstances that led to his conviction. Bowman's execution was met with waves of protest. Civil rights organizations, legal advocates, and ordinary citizens rallied outside the prison gates, calling for clemency and a reassessment of capital punishment in South Carolina. Their voices, though not enough to overturn Bowman's fate, have injected momentum into the growing movement opposing the death penalty. South Carolina's aggressive push to reinstate executions after over a decade generates broader questions about political motivations. Were lives like Bowman's being risked to make a statement? Bowman's attorneys argued until the very end that not all evidence was considered during his trial and appeals. Claims of withheld evidence that might have pointed to his innocence have not been thoroughly reviewed, despite advances in forensic investigation techniques over the years. Death penalty critics highlight cases like Bowman's as emblematic of how the criminal justice system lacks proper mechanisms to reevaluate cases once convictions are secured. When the death penalty forbids mistakes, Bowman's story forces us to confront a harrowing question: did South Carolina execute an innocent man? Behind every death row inmate is a family left shattered by the system. Marion Bowman's loved ones stood by him throughout his incarceration, maintaining hope even in the grimmest moments. For them, this wasn't justice. It was a second tragedy. While legal battles attempted to reopen Bowman's case, his family fought for recognition of his humanity, sharing stories of his compassion and resolve to transform despite the circumstances. For the Bowmans, Marion's execution is a wound that will never heal. Marion's story isn't unique. It is part of a broader tapestry of cases riddled with doubts, inequalities, and missteps. From racially biased trials to rushed verdicts, the faults in the American justice system aren't new. Studies reveal that defendants from minority communities face higher rates of conviction and harsher penalties, raising pressing questions about equal justice. Moreover, the disproportionate targets of the death penalty overwhelmingly come from lower socioeconomic classes, further amplifying systemic inequality. Marion Bowman was another victim of this system, one that favors the privileged and condemns the poor. In his final days, Bowman's words painted a vivid picture of his character. We are kind, caring, loving people. This statement invites all of us to rethink how we perceive incarcerated individuals. Society often vilifies those on death row, erasing their humanity while failing to understand the circumstances and systemic failures that led them there. Bowman's narrative reminds us that a person is not solely defined by the worst moment of their life, that even in the bleakest places, growth and change are possible. This humanization is a call for justice, not vengeance. While Bowman's case is situated within South Carolina's justice system, it echoes an international debate. The United States remains one of the few developed nations to retain the death penalty. Globally, many countries denounce American practices as barbaric remnants of a punitive judicial philosophy. Observing cases like Bowman's in a global context sheds light on how far the U.S. lags behind in embracing restorative justice and ethical judicial systems. Marion Bowman Jr.'s execution forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about justice, forgiveness, and the true role of a judicial system. If justice demands fairness underpinned by morality, can we continue to justify state-sanctioned death in systems rife with inequities? His case also serves as a grim warning about the cost of getting it wrong. With forensic advancements and posthumous exonerations of death row inmates, Bowman's death becomes not just a tragedy, but an emblem of the failures death penalty systems are prone to. Marion Bowman's story is far from over. His death leaves behind unanswered questions, lingering doubt, and a call for systemic change. For those who protested outside the prison that night, Bowman stood for more than his case. He became a catalyst for reimagining justice in a broken system. As Bowman's ashes return to his family, his legacy must serve as a rallying cry. We must critically examine the role of capital punishment in our society, strive for equality in our courts, and work toward a justice system that doesn't sacrifice humanity on the altar of vengeance. If nothing else, Marion Bowman's life and death remind us of one unshakable truth. Justice without fairness is no justice at all.